Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast, and welcome to part 2 of our excursion into Asian horror films from the year 2006. Now we have some more unimpressive titles to get through tonight, but there are a few pretty good movies that we will take a look at near the end of this video. And as always, titles for all the movies I discuss will be listed in the description box below. And our first film tonight is called Stories of Apparitions Seen in Photos, a Japanese horror anthology. So this is an anthology of 5 stories, 93 minutes in total, or approximately 18 minutes each on average, related to the popular ghost photograph phenomenon in Japan known as Shinrei Shashin. This is directed by Koji Shiraishi, who I am a big fan of. He previously gave us films such as Noroi and Dead Girl Walking. Unfortunately, this is one of Shiraishi's weaker movies, I think, because it lacks the creativity of most of his better stuff. The mood is pretty eerie at times, with some effectively ominous sound design, but the acting is mediocre for the most part. Storylines are also somewhat simplistic and dull, in my opinion. So let's go through these very quickly, shall we? The first story in this anthology is called Pictures with No Object. A young man and woman driving through the woods almost hit another woman who's on this back road. Now, the story, or the film I should say, goes into flashback mode, where the woman on the road was previously hiking in the forest with 2 of her friends. It's kind of during the winter times. There's some snow on the trees and the ground. And they encounter a rotting corpse that's hanging from a tree limb. Now, the snowy trees do give some atmosphere, and there is a slightly creepy vibe to it all. I do kind of like the atmosphere to this one. However, there's too much stuff that I found irritating in this one. For example, the lead actress is not a good screamer. She's very weak in that regard. You could tell she tries, but she screams like maybe 4 or 5 times, and each time it's just not, it's kind of embarrassing. She doesn't have the pipes to really make it work. There's a self-inflicted sprained ankle along the way, as well as a car that will not start at an important time, so you kind of roll your eyes during those scenes. There's other stuff too with regards to some cliches there, but I do think this one had potential at the start, but it just kind of sputtered along. The ending is okay. So this one's not really that impressive. The second story here is called Watching You. So a high school girl arrives at school one morning noticing a commotion, and the students are kind of freaked out by a bizarre picture that someone posted on the bulletin board, which seemingly points to a curse that has been placed on our protagonist. Now this one starts off okay, kind of like the Pictures with No Objects segment, but it gets fairly boring fairly quickly, actually. And the ending is a big anticlimax. Does not stick the ending. So this one, again, just real mediocre stuff. Third story here is called Memorable Polaroid. And this one is set during Christmas, which is a nice change of pace, but it's completely lacking in Christmas atmosphere. I mean, I think there's one little Christmas tree that you see, and it's kind of a flimsy one. Doesn't look all that good. So some friends basically sit around a table and discuss paranormal stuff. Like the photos one of them took that shows some odd images. So this is possibly the most mundane of all of the segments in this anthology. Definitely the least interesting for most of its runtime. It takes place all in one room, and it doesn't get interesting until the very end, which has a pretty decent twist to it, but then it ruins everything with a stupefying second twist that really doesn't make much sense. So, yeah, I'm not a fan of Memorable Polaroid either. Then we have Peeping Tom, the fourth story. A stalker secretly takes pictures of a cute swimming instructor, but realizes that she may be haunted. So he initially is infatuated with her, and then he's concerned with her well-being. This one's a bit different, having a pervert as the protagonist, but the ending was kind of lame. Again, these segments really have trouble sticking their endings. Not enough interesting character interaction to drive this one either. We're going to cover some Japanese horror anthologies during the 2010s when we get that far that have some awesome stalker elements, so look forward to that. This one, not too good. Then finally, the final short here is Strange Delivery. A woman believes she's haunted, so she seeks advice from a man who can see ghosts. Fairly generic premise, but I did like the types of ghostly phenomena that were shown near the end. It's not like a typical shot of a ghost, if that makes any sense. I kind of liked that. It was a little bit different, what they showed. This one, I kind of liked, but not that much. Not worth watching the whole anthology to get to this one either, so, nah. Stories of apparitions seen in photos are just not very good, unfortunately. A disappointment from my boy, Shiraishi. I would actually rather watch the much-maligned Jurei the Uncanny, one of his previous films, again instead of this one, because at least that movie was loaded with horror scenes and had a few memorable sequences, I think. Let's move on here, and we go to the Philippines with a film called Sukob, also known as The Wedding Curse. A young woman's marriage becomes cursed, leading to the disappearance of her friends and relatives, one by one. Now, our protagonist basically travels back to the Philippines, from what I remember, possibly from Dubai, I think, after an international job is completed, and she plans to marry. Unfortunately, though, she's met with some bad news about her childhood friend who died along with her family because she married within 1 year of her father's death, which is apparently a big no-no in this movie's mythology, because it creates a deadly curse. So our protagonist promptly has her wedding, because I don't think she did have too many family deaths in her family during the previous year, but bad stuff still starts happening to her, which is kind of sets forward the mystery, if I remember correctly. So this film was a big hit in its home country, breaking like the all-time box office record, I think, and holding it for at least 3 years, I believe. But it's not all that impressive, in my opinion. The acting is fine, but the horror scenes are fairly poor, really, using a mix of ghostly boos and some accidents. It also uses some familiar elements like distorted heads that are shown in photographs. You know, how many times are we going to see that? The ho-hum script also doesn't make up for any of these other blemishes. With so many great Asian ghost films that were released during this particular era, Suco just kind of gets overshadowed by so many better, similar movies. Not really a fan of this one. If you want to crack into contemporary Filipino horror, check out Feng Shui or The Echo, which were both released in 2004. And then if you like those, maybe check out some of the other Filipino stuff like Sukob or some of the other stuff. Do not recommend this one. Now we move to another country. We're country hopping here tonight. We go to Thailand, and this one is called Ghost Game. This tells the story of 11 contestants who sign up for a scary reality show, which forces them to confront the supernatural in their innermost fears. So they're brought to an ancient war museum in Cambodia, which was used as a prison 20 years before. Thousands of innocent people were tortured and killed, apparently, during the Cambodian War in the 1970s. So now the museum is abandoned and no one dares to step inside. So the single winner of the show will be rewarded 5 million baht, which is approximately 130,000 US dollars or so, at least as of 2006. The highest amount ever offered in a Thai game show. So inspired by the big reward, they accept to risk their lives in the museum, confronting traps set by the show's producers, as well as those of the real ghosts whose spirits still haunt the place. Now, from what I've heard, this film may have garnered a little bit of controversy because, referencing this Cambodian war and all the atrocities that occurred during it, and kind of portraying it as a reality game show to the death, I guess rubbed some people the wrong way. But, it has a creepy setting and pretty good acting, actually. But there are too many jump scares, man. Too many jump scares during the first half, and then it transitions to some other lame scare tactics during the second half. A movie like this is really important in terms of really nailing the scare tactics. That's what this one in particular is all about. You don't get a whole lot of character development or storyline development. It goes for the scare tactics, and it doesn't really execute them all that well. it kind of hurts the entertainment value, definitely. And that's frustrating because, as I said before, the setting really kind of works here. They picked the right place to film. They just couldn't execute the scares themselves. And even the pacing has some problems in this, because there's some lengthy patches of dullness in this one, which is not something you would expect given the high-octane premise. So Ghost Game, in general, I think gets pretty poor reviews online, and it's understandable, because this one's pretty disappointing. I do not recommend it. Now, our next handful of films are from South Korea, and they all kind of suffer from the similar problems: mediocrity and genre cliches. So now I'll be the first to tell you that there's really not much to complain about regarding creativity and overall quality within the Asian horror film industry from the last 20 or so years. Mostly because you could keep yourself busy for a long time watching all of the entertaining horror films that have been produced. However, I'll also be the first one to say that one of the industry trends that emerged was these supernatural ghost films. They made quite a few of them, some of which feel like rehashes of films that came before. And this is, if you think about it, not necessarily a bad thing if the quality is good enough to compensate. For example, I thought Ryong, or also known as The Ghost, from 2004 was quite good, despite being, fairly cliched. And another thing that can help is some creative touches or added complexity to keep things interesting. For example, Whispering Corridors 4 Voice from 2005, which I really like. Unfortunately, I think our next few South Korean films are lacking in these qualities. They don't really compensate for their cliches. And since they suffer from some of the same flaws, I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. Now, the first one here is called Forbidden Floor. Again, from South Korea. A divorced single mother moves into the 5th floor of a new studio apartment with her 6-year-old daughter. She's concerned when her downstairs neighbor says that he cannot tolerate the noise above him, even though the two women live tranquilly. Furthermore, she's anxious about other residents' strange behaviors, as well as the mysterious deaths that are occurring in the immediate area. So this has basically the same premise as the Japanese film Dark Water, but it's not as good as that film. The acting by the two leads is impressive. I liked the two female leads in this, but the negatives are the weak scare tactics and the unsatisfying conclusion. So in terms of the horror, the sound design is pretty good, but there is some atmosphere at times. But there seems to be a problem with the direction itself and the way that the death scenes are staged, some of which have a slightly cheesy vibe to them. The Onryo ghost does show up, by the way, so if you don't like that, that will bother you here. Just something about, when you see the death scenes, in theory they really could work, but I don't know, I think the direction was off in this one. There just isn't enough craftsmanship to it. The finale does have one moderately impactful act of violence, but there's an additional scene near the end that shows an act of revenge by the ghost that feels kind of hokey. Yeah, just the final scene of this movie just leaves a bad taste in your mouth. It's not the way you want to end your movie. So Forbidden Floor I don't think is necessarily a bad film in terms of overall quality, but there's simply no reason to seek it out. Watch some of the better Asian horror films with a similar premise, like Dark Water, for example. Now, this film, Forbidden Floor, was part of the 4 Horror Tales film series, so we have covered the less impressive entries right now, Forbidden Floor and Dark Forest. But the 2 that I'm going to review in my next video are more entertaining, so look out for that. Alright, the next one here from South Korea is APT, also known as Apartment. Now, a young woman lives in an old apartment in a Seoul suburb and amuses herself by observing the windows of the apartments on the other side. Now, one day, she notices that the lights of some of these apartments are turned off at the very same time. She begins to suspect that this pattern is somehow related to a series of mysterious deaths in the neighborhood, and she becomes more and more deeply involved as she attempts to solve the mystery. Wow. What an original premise. So this one is formulaic and mostly bland, unsurprisingly. It invokes the unreal ghost again frequently. The weird movements and creaky noises that are used do work pretty well, I think, but there's not enough oomph in the characters, the storyline, or the horror scenes to make a lasting impression on this one. It really does kind of feel like a carbon copy, you know what I mean, that they just churned out. The performances and the direction, they're pretty good, I guess, as one would expect from most South Korean films, but the ending is very unsatisfying and gimmicky. So you can see a theme here in this video, a lot of unsatisfying endings to these movies. It's a lot of horror films do have trouble sticking their endings, but man, it's some of the movies we're covering tonight, it's one of the bigger flaws, I think, in addition to some of the cliches and other familiarities. So APT, I do not recommend it. And then the next Korean horror film here is called Arang. IMDb gives this plot synopsis. A salt storehouse near the sea may be haunted when a penniless ex-con dies a grisly death. The detectives assigned the case are Min, newly reinstated after a suspension, and Lee, a new transfer from forensics. Min has nightmares from a sexual assault that still haunts her. So she and Lee work well together, but soon 2 more deaths occur, each mysteriously poisoned, both friends of the ex-con that they've been investigating. So a 4th friend shows up and is the primary suspect. But what has all this to do with the salt storehouse, a death 10 years ago, and a missing girl? So can these two get to the bottom of it, or is the supernatural beyond a cop's reach? So this has all been seen before, this type of stuff. Formulaic scares and the generic mystery plotline. One minor contribution of creativity bridges corpse decomposition and another element, which I won't reveal to avoid spoiling the twist for you if you have not seen this one already. But, I kind of liked that nuance, a little bit of creativity that's thrown in near the end. But it isn't really forceful enough to compensate for all the other mediocre stuff in this one. But again, I do know some people who online who do enjoy APT and Arang, so, mostly because the acting and the direction are pretty good on both of them. So, these are, I would say that if you're still kind of getting into Asian horror, obviously watch my previous videos, hit a lot of the big ones first in terms of the ghost films, and then as you start churning through them all, then you can maybe try out some of these ones that are just mediocre, but that some people like, stuff like APT and Arang. So now we move away from South Korea and move back to the Philippines for our next one. And this film is called Text, TXT. This is our last film of the night that I do not recommend, so hang in there. Now, this is a story that conquers the old adage, till death do us part. A man named Roman dies in a car accident. In a restless and unforgiving state, he continues to prove his affection for his ex-girlfriend, Joyce. He then decides to embark on an intrepid and malevolent journey in order to keep her. So this girl begins having hair-raising text messages sent to her and even gets death photos of people close to her, including that of her current boyfriend. So she initially ignores these things, but when the deaths happen under the exact circumstances at which they are predicted, she realizes that she must fight the evil behind all these to protect her loved ones from the supernatural force. Now that's a little bit of a different take on some of the supernatural horror films. It's not a spirit that's just out for revenge. It's a spirit that's has romantic jealousy to his ex-girlfriend. So that's a little bit different. Most of the horror scenes are unfortunately ineffective, I believe. And some are shamelessly ripped off from other movies like One Missed Call and Pulse. While reading some online reviews for Text, I noticed that many people complain that Filipino horror films from the 21st century are too influenced by Japanese horror films that came out during the turn of the century. And I can understand that complaint when one considers films like Text and Sukob. On the positive side, though, Text does have pretty good acting, And there are a few good jokes here too. I actually giggled a few times at the humor, which was nice. There's also a very cool, unexpected twist tossed in near the end, but the script writing then becomes incompetent down the stretch, which leads to a wholly unsatisfying finale. Again, unsatisfying finale. The trend for this video. So, again, kind of like some of the other films we're covering tonight, none of them are really terrible, but they're just lacking something to get it into a recommendable status for me. So let's end this video with 3 films that I actually found to be somewhat watchable. The first one is a Hong Kong horror film called Wife from Hell. Now, after hesitating at a decisive moment, a man finds himself in danger. Now, from what I remember, the main character is talented within the medical community, but his success has been constantly held back by the health issues of his wife. So he starts to have a bit of a midlife crisis here, and the bad advice from one of his sleazeball friends starts to work its way into his mind, despite the fact that his wife is very nice and faithful. So, some hot women enter the mix, and some career opportunities show up, and, it creates a dilemma for our protagonist. This film has a serious tone, so it's not like some of the, Hong Kong horror comedies that we cover at sometimes. It is deliberately paced. It introduces multiple threats and relies heavily upon scoring and lighting in place of gore. And for the most part, it works well. It's definitely tempered and generally avoids over-the-top scenes. The 2 lead characters are properly developed, making this feel more like a psychological horror film than anything else. Also, the overall style in this was just atypical, and it's hard to explain exactly why I feel that way, but it just felt a little bit different, the way it was presented, and maybe it's just a little bit different from a lot of the Hong Kong horror comedies that we've been used to. But, Wife from Hell I thought was a pretty good flick. It's watchable. Now, DVD availability of this is that it is moderately available. You could find a few copies floating around, but there's not a lot floating around. So we will continue with our country hopping here. And we move now to Vietnam with a film called Love Never Dies. And this is a horror romance. Now, I've mentioned in a prior video that I have not seen many Vietnamese horror films. The only one I've reviewed so far was Spirits from 2004, which was pretty good. So can Love Never Dies also earn a pass grade? Well, let's see. It obviously does, given the order in which I'm reviewing it. So after suffering multiple miscarriages, a woman attempts to save her marriage while she suffers from enigmatic visions. So this is one of those horror films that focuses a lot on the dramatic side of things, and in this case, that's a positive thing. Despite lasting about 60 or so minutes, which is a fairly short runtime, the movie does establish its conflicts well enough for the viewer to understand the lead protagonist's emotional distress. It does have a few scares that are a bit on the weak side, and it does lack some originality, but it certainly compensates with a quality script and some classy execution. I like some of the architecture that's showcased at times, too. So this one I found to be pretty enjoyable, pretty good flick. And it's interesting that we've reviewed 2 horror films in a row that have kind of romantic elements infused in them and are also more low-key than usual. That was kind of interesting. Now, unfortunately, Love Never Dies is difficult to find. I was checking everywhere the other day just to see if I could find a DVD or maybe if it was streaming somewhere like YouTube, but I can't find it anywhere. So, just put it on your lists for one to check out if you want a little flavor from Vietnam, because you're not going to get too many Vietnamese horror films out there, at least released in the West. Now, our final film tonight here is one that's pretty good. And we move again to another country. This is from Indonesia. This one is called Pokmon II. Now, this is a very low-budget film about 2 sisters who are haunted by a spirit in their newly rented apartment. So, yeah, the premise is cliched, quite cliched, but the execution here I think is pretty good. The acting in particular is first rate, and the filmmakers take a lot of time to develop the relationship between these sisters, which really drives the entire film. From what I remember, these sisters were orphaned at a young age and have been supporting one another for years. But one of them plans to get married now, and that creates some anxiety for the other sister who, feels a little bit like she's being abandoned. So the horror scenes in this range from mediocre to pretty good, using a mix of supernatural and human threats. No Japanese onryo ghosts are used here. You don't have to worry about that. The Pocong itself, though, is kind of cheesy, I thought, because it's a human spirit that's kind of wrapped. It's wrapped kind of like a mummy with the face exposed. And it usually has like white eyeballs, which is actually kind of creepy. You see that a lot in Indonesian horror films. They tend to use white eyes for their ghosts, which I like. But, and it hops around like an Easter bunny. It does. But it still can get a little creepy at times. I gotta tell you. It's certainly something different in terms of a spirit design from what I've seen. And I think it's entertaining to watch. Even if you don't find it scary, it's pretty different. So this film, I do think, has a bit of heart to it. It just felt like it was one of those films where there was effort put in, and even though the production values aren't there and it's really nothing great, I thought it was watchable. I liked it. Now, availability of Pokmon II is that it is difficult to find, but I have seen a few DVDs floating around on the internet without subtitles. Not sure how that would go with this one, because there's a lot of development between the sisters, but you might be able to get that without subs based on their interactions in the film. Alright, so that's it for part 2 on this journey through Asian horror films released in 2006. And be sure to join me for part 3, when I will continue to review the more interesting films from this year. And as always, see you next time.